again, this is Nonprofits 101. So very briefly at the start, my name is Ben Sutton. I'm the Director of Preservation. I'll be going over sort of really the basic fundamentals of what you need to be thinking about if you're considering a nonprofit organization. Our president and CEO, Wright Mitchell, is with us. He's going to be covering really the nuts and bolts of correctly creating and establishing a nonprofit organization so that you're legal and authentic and people can give you money appropriately. And then we're really fortunate to have our friends from Wilkes County with the Friends of Cherry Grove Schoolhouse, who are going to provide a really interesting case study about their process and in creating a friends group, nonprofit friends group, to focus on the preservation of really significant and important schoolhouse in rural Wilkes County. So we're really excited to have them with us. But without further ado, we will jump in. Let me see. Can everybody see my screen all right? Yep, great. All right. So in the world of preservation, creating and establishing a nonprofit friends group has been proven to be one of the most effective tools for preservation of a site. And that's really because preservation comes down to money. Almost 9 times out of 10, it comes down to what we like to say is there an agreement on whether or not it should be saved? Oftentimes there is. And then the second problem is how are you going to fund the work that's necessary to make sure your site is preserved? And there's been throughout Georgia, throughout the United States, there's been a lot of successful examples of friends groups. So obviously, most of us are well aware of nonprofit organizations. There are lots of different types, so it's important to understand exactly what we're talking about. So nonprofit versus tax exempt, there is a distinction. When we are generally talking about nonprofits, what we are frequently referring to are public charities or charitable nonprofits that the IRS defines in their code 501c3. So a lot of times you'll hear folks talking about their 501c3 organization. And that really does clearly define what the role and goal of those organizations are. There are other tax-exempt organizations that are not nonprofits, homeowners associations, chambers of commerce, different organizations that may be trying to accomplish a goal but are not necessarily a charitable organization. So all that to say, typically when you hear folks talking about a nonprofit or running a nonprofit, what they are talking about is a charitable organization, a 501c3. That can be a public charity. It can also be a private foundation. In the world of preservation, if you are going to be creating a friends group or you have a friends group that is a standalone nonprofit, that is going to be a public charity. Private foundations have their primary goal as actually funding other organizations. So typically a private foundation is going to have the money. They're not looking to raise the money, whereas a public charity is established primarily to raise funds for their mission. One thing that's really important to note from the IRS's perspective, churches and religious organizations fall under that 501c3 umbrella. I know in the African American community that church buildings are one of the primary areas where or sites where folks are focused on preserving their heritage and their history. According to the IRS, you can in fact raise funds sort of for that for that purpose through the church organization. One thing I will point out, though, and I think the Friends of Cherry Grove may be able to touch on this as well, there are limits to what funding churches and religious organizations are able to go after, particularly if there are grants that are tied to state government, and even some private foundations will not fund religious organizations. So frequently, having a nonprofit, even if there's a building that's associated with a religious organization or owned by a religious organization, having a nonprofit that is able to fund and has a mission outside of that religious rationale can be an assistance in fundraising. So that's just the very basics of nonprofit versus tax exempt and things for you to consider. So if you have a historic site that you're hoping to fundraise for, there may be an established nonprofit. If not, you certainly considering whether or not you should start one is an important step. And it's really important before you sort of jump in with both feet to consider a lot of things. Across the country, about half of nonprofit organizations fail. Almost always that is from a lack of planning. And a lack of planning is going to lead to a lack of funding. And nonprofit organizations are businesses. They don't make a profit, but they are established as a business. They have to be able to function, cover their costs and things like that. Without funding, a nonprofit is not going to be successful. And without planning, particularly at the front end of the process, achieving those funding goals can certainly be a challenge. One thing we like to tell everybody and remind folks over and over again, nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model, right? So you are creating these organizations with the intent of getting money. The only difference between this business model and a for-profit business model is how you spend that money and what the money goes to, right? So you're not necessarily, you need to sort of reframe it in your mind. We frequently think, and culturally we think about a nonprofit doing good, trying to serve the community. The fact of the matter is you can't do that if you're not making money, right? So always be thinking about how your nonprofit is going to earn money, whether it's through revenue, whether it's through donations, whether it's through large grants. The nonprofit in your name does not mean that you can't make money. It just means you can't distribute it as a profit, right? So thinking through these things, creating a strong business model, planning before you get going, all very critical, because setting the right foundation for your organization is going to lead to its long-term success. So if you are advocating for a historic site, if you are thinking about establishing a nonprofit, there are certain things you absolutely should be considering. Number one, what is the need, right? Does your nonprofit fulfill a need? Do you have proof that your nonprofit will fill an unmet need in your community? Frequently, this is pretty straightforward if you are establishing a friends group or a nonprofit focused on preservation of a specific site. The need is the ability to preserve and maintain an important historic structure. So being able to gather the support, receiving grants, having folks buy into your vision and donate money becomes a whole lot easier if you have that need defined. Another really important thing to consider is whether or not there are other organizations already doing what you're planning to do. Does your nonprofit add extra value to your community? Now, again, most common in the preservation world are a friends group, a nonprofit established specifically around a site or the preservation of an important resource. So typically you're not necessarily going to be directly competing with another organization. But it is something absolutely you should consider, particularly if you're thinking more broadly about sort of a preservation advocacy organization, whether or not your need is in competition with another one. Now, it doesn't mean you can't both exist, but if you are in competition and sort of working at cross purposes, you're not just competing for the mission, you're going to be competing for dollars as well. So that's something absolutely you should be keeping in mind at the beginning of the process. And it's really important to understand that there is sort of a really strong, in Georgia, a really strong advocacy network for preservation. We're really fortunate to have a lot of strong preservation partners. So at the national level, there's the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We are the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. So we are the primary preservation advocacy group for with a statewide mission. And then around the state, there's a lot of really strong local preservation organizations. If you live in any of those areas with a red dot, you should absolutely be familiar with and looking to partner with your local preservation organizations. And of course, the Georgia Trust is always here as a resource. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be creating or considering your own nonprofit organization, because again, you may be focused on the preservation of a specific site, whereas these organizations are set up as broader advocacy organizations. But it's important to know that you are not alone and that there is a good network in the state of Georgia. And if you don't know, we have very good friends over at the Georgia African American Historic Preservation Network. This is again, a statewide nonprofit. They have a liaison at the Historic Preservation Division. But this is a group of folks who are advocates for preservation of African American sites all around the state. Many of them are tied to preservation projects, and they are an excellent network to tap into for preservation advice, best practices, and just helping to tell your story. So it's important to know about this network if you're not familiar with it already. But then moving back to your considerations, one thing that's really important to consider, particularly with a preservation group or a nonprofit group that may be focused on the preservation of one site, nonprofits should have an ongoing mission. So it should be established to maintain and meet that mission with no end date in mind. And if your need is a short-term project, creating a nonprofit is unlikely to be worth the cost and the effort, as you'll see when Wright jumps in. It is not not necessarily a straightforward process to establish a nonprofit group. It requires a lot of effort and a lot of desire and a lot of support. So if there is a short-term need, there may very well be opportunities outside of creating a nonprofit organization. You potentially could consider partnering with an existing organization. But really what I want to emphasize here is your mission should be ongoing, right? So the primary mission or your initial goal may be raising funds to preserve a building, to take over or to do the necessary maintenance and repairs to get your building preserved. But it shouldn't end there, right? You need to have a mission beyond just fixing what's broken right now. And I know that Barrett will talk about this a little bit when the Friends group gets going. But when you are considering whether or not your organization or what your organization does and how you communicate that to the public, think beyond just a new roof or fixing the steps, right? Think about how that part of the process will meet part of your mission, and then be considering what the the further mission of the organization will be. Because again, nonprofit, if you're going to all of the work to create a nonprofit, maintain a nonprofit, fundraise for it, you certainly need to be considering how you're going to be compliant and how you're going to be self-sustaining and sufficient into the future. And meeting your mission is going to be the most critical aspect of that. So what is your mission? Every nonprofit should have a mission statement. Every good nonprofit has a strong mission statement that communicates your purpose, the groups that it may serve, and how it plans to accomplish its purpose. So for a new nonprofit, developing a mission statement is a very critical first step in defining what you plan to do and what makes your organization different from others. Remember, going back to that earlier conversation about whether or not you are duplicating an existing nonprofit. Your mission statement is your opportunity to explain to the world in a very brief opportunity what you do, why it's different from others, and why it's important. So this is really step one. There are lots and lots of steps, but if you can't create a very concise and effective mission statement, you may need to go back and consider whether or not establishing a nonprofit is the right path. So when considering a mission statement, keep it short and simple. A 12-year-old ought to be able to read your mission statement and understand what you're trying to do. Historic preservation lends itself to really effective mission statements if you stay out of the weeds, right? If you just say, I want to save this building and here's why, that's great. Make it specific. So again, what differentiates you from other nonprofits with a similar mission? Oftentimes it's just that we are focused on the preservation of this specific historic resource, and this is why that is important. And then again, going back to the to the previous slide, make it timeless. It should apply to the work you're doing now as well as your future goals. So we want to raise funds, we want to preserve this building, and then what's that next step, right? Once you've been successful in preserving the building, why do you need to maintain your organization? Why do you exist beyond that initial goal? And then just to wrap it up, I always like to highlight our mission statement. The mission of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation is to work for the preservation and revitalization of Georgia's diverse historic resources and to advocate for their appreciation, protection, and use. So that, we've been around 50 years. Somebody asks us what we do, that's what we tell folks, right? Our mission statement, we may be doing 18 different things, but everything leads back to our simple mission statement. So when you are considering your nonprofit, whether it's already existing, whether you're thinking about creating one, think about the strength of your mission statement and how that ties directly into how you'll serve the community, how you'll serve your resource, and then how you will attract folks to support you. And that's all I've got. So just laying the groundwork. We're going to transition now to Wright Mitchell, who actually has some direct experience in creating a nonprofit organization. Also happens to be an attorney, so he is going to cover a lot of the basics and steps 1 through, I don't know, 10 of how to establish a nonprofit organization, how to make sure you're compliant with state and federal law, so that folks can give you money and feel confident that they are doing so in a way that will support your organization, but also allow them to have some benefit as well.
All right, good morning. Can you all hear me? So thank you for all being here this morning. I appreciate the lead in by Ben. Ben got to cover the exciting stuff about missions and passion, and I get to cover the dry, boring stuff about how to legally go about forming your nonprofit. So, but obviously very important to have your nonprofit legally set up. As Ben mentioned, I have been in many of your shoes. I formed a small nonprofit back in 2005, 2006 called the Buckhead Heritage Society. So at the time, although I was an attorney, I had never formed a nonprofit. So I had to kind of figure things out on my own, and some of the incorporating documents that I created back in 05, 06, I'll be using as an example here. And I'm happy to share those with any of you that would like to have copies of them after the presentation. Just reach out to Ben or to me, and I'll forward them along. But when I incorporated the Buckhead Heritage Society, things were much more difficult from the standpoint of actually creating the logistics of creating a nonprofit, because it was before the Georgia Secretary of State had everything online. So now the process is much simpler. You can simply just go to the Georgia Secretary of State website and do a lot of this directly online versus having to create articles of incorporation and mail them in and get copies stamped and sent back to you. So things have changed a lot since 2005 for the better. It's a much easier process now. And like I said, much of it can be done online, which simplifies things, especially if you live in a rural area. So, first thing you have to do is come up with an idea, as Ben said, for your nonprofit. What is the need to be served? Is there a need? Is there any other organization in the community doing the same thing that fits that need? If not, then what is your mission going to be? As I mentioned, our mission at Buckhead Heritage was to protect and preserve Buckhead's historic resources. Buckhead did not have a historic preservation group, so there was a definite need for it, and we had a number of distressed and endangered historic sites in Buckhead that needed attention. So, the need was there. We had a number of people who were interested in getting involved, and that's kind of the first step, is getting your group together before you even proceed with filing articles of incorporation. You need to get a group of people together that are willing to serve as officers and board members. You don't necessarily need to know who's going to serve what officer role, but there needs to be a nucleus of people who share the same common goal as you do. You can, if you're wondering what to call your nonprofit, you can submit very early on a name reservation. So if you, for example, we submitted Buckhead Preservation Society, Inc., and the Secretary of State will tell you whether that name is available or someone else has already claimed it. And usually they ask you to list 3 preferences. This is the form that you would file.
Right.
So,
do you mind going to slide view real quick, just so we can see it full screen? If you go to slideshow up at the top and view from current slide, or play from current slide. Perfect.
that?
That's great. Thank you.
Oh, now I went back. I think we froze there for a minute.
Yeah, we got you back. You're good.
All right, so this is a name reservation form, and you can see you can list 3 names and submit it to the Secretary of State online, and the Secretary of State will tell you whether your name is available or if it's already been claimed. If it's available, they'll hold it for you for a period of time for $25. So yeah, that's kind of the first, as you're talking about, articles of incorporation and forming the group and getting your nucleus of people together. You might want to file a name registration just to hold whatever name it is you come up with, Friends of, XYZ Church or whatever it is. So after you have gotten your group of folks together, and all of this is simplified now because if you go to the Secretary of State website, it will walk you through kind of a checklist of these items, but you have to, the first step in incorporating your nonprofit is to file articles of incorporation with the Georgia Secretary of State, or whatever the Secretary of State office is in your jurisdiction. In Georgia, the articles of incorporation have to set forth the corporate name of the corporation, the organization, the street address, and county of the corporation's initial registered office, and the name of the registered agent at that office. So a registered agent is someone who is appointed for purposes of receiving service of process. So if, for example, the Friends Group was sued for some reason, there has to be someone named as the registered agent to accept service of process on behalf of the Friends Group. The name and address of each incorporator, usually that's just one person. In the case of Buckhead Heritage Society, I was the incorporator, which you'll see on our articles of incorporation, but I had already lined up my board and my officers. Whether or not the corporation will have members, the mailing address of the initial principal office of the corporation, if different from the registered office, a statement that the corporation is organized pursuant to the Georgia Nonprofit Code. And the filing fee is $110 in Georgia. So now I don't know, Danielle, if I can, it's not letting me click anymore.
You might have, okay, you might have to escape and
go back.
Yeah.
Well, I can't get it to open up, but at any rate, so these are the the articles of incorporation for the Buckhead Preservation Society. And really the important thing I want to point out is here on the first page. Go back. Is all articles of incorporation have to have financial dedication language that states that they're set up pursuant to federal income tax section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. So that will simply incorporating a nonprofit with the state of Georgia does not give you tax exempt status. That simply establishes your organization as a nonprofit corporation under Georgia law. There's another set of steps you have to go through to get your tax exempt status, which of course is granted by the Internal Revenue Service at the federal level. So the first step of incorporating is simply just establishing the business entity with the state of Georgia Secretary of State, but you have to include this language in your articles of organization or incorporation stating that you're setting it up as a tax exempt organization.
I have it pulled up if you want me to share screen, right?
Okay, sure. Do I need to stop sharing my screen?
No, you're good. I think I can share. Okay. Do y'all see that?
Yes.
So, okay, great. So in Article 1, we got the name of the corporation, which is required. The affirmation that it's organized pursuant to the Georgia Nonprofit Corporation Code, which is required. The purpose of the organization, which is simply just a reiteration of the mission statement, promoting an appreciation, awareness of the history of Buckhead. The financial dedication language, which states that it's being set up pursuant to pursuant to section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Can you advance, Danielle? More IRS language. The registered office and registered agent, which at the time I was working as an attorney at Colony Square. So I named myself as a registered agent, and the registered office was my law office. I was also the incorporator. So it can be your home. It doesn't have to be, an office. Anyone can serve as a registered agent, provided that you're over the age of 18 and of sound mind. So, typically this would be whoever the president of the 501c3 is going to be would also be the incorporator and usually the registered agent, but it could be any officer of the corporation, or it could be an attorney if you've got an attorney helping you out. So can we go to the next slide? And also the articles of incorporation will set forth a little bit about the management of the organization, although that really is done through the corporate bylaws, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It will typically, can you advance to the next slide? So, it's really a very simple form, the articles of incorporation. And once you've filed that, it usually takes a day or two, and the state of Georgia will come back and either accept the filing or they'll reject it, and they'll say, you need to do X, Y, Z, and then you go back in and correct it. But it's really a very simple. I mean, you can get this process going in 15 minutes on the Georgia Secretary of State website. This is the easy part of setting up the nonprofit. The more kind of difficult part comes in creating the management structure of the nonprofit, which is done through the establishment of the bylaws. So I'm going to get back to the PowerPoint. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention is that you also have to publish in the paper of record for your county a notice stating that you intend to incorporate, and you just have to put down the name, which hopefully you will have reserved through your name reservation, and that must be published in the paper in the county where you're going to where the principal office of the organization is going to be. You'll want to hold an initial meeting. It's not imperative that it be done before you file the articles of incorporation. If you've got a group of people that are willing to serve as officers and board members, you can go ahead and do that and then have your organizational meeting. Of course, you've got to, when you incorporate, you've got to list your president, secretary, and treasurer. So you'd want commitments lined up from 3 people that they're willing to serve in that capacity.
We are not seeing your slides anymore, right? Sorry.
How about now?
Perfect.
Oh boy.
I think, yes, perfect. Now we see it properly.
Okay, so yes, so you need a president, a secretary, and a treasurer. The president is going to be the person who runs the organization. Your secretary is going to be the person who takes minutes at each meeting. It's very important to keep minutes of all of your board meetings. And the treasurer is going to be the individual who manages the finances of the organization and makes sure that the tax return, which is called the Form 990, is filed each year. As far as meetings go, the only requirement, the only state law requirement is that you hold one annual meeting. You can have as many or as few meetings as you wish. Typically, organizations will meet quarterly, so there'll be 4 meetings, and one of those 4 meetings can serve as your annual meeting. At the organizational meeting, you'll want to adopt your bylaws, which name the officers and how many board members you're going to have. You do not have to file your bylaws with the state of Georgia. It's, always good to get an attorney to help you put your bylaws together. These are the bylaws of the Buckhead Preservation Society. I'm hesitant to try and show you all of them, so we don't have a repeat of what just happened. But like I said, I'm happy to share these documents with anyone who would like them. But it basically sets up the structure. It says how many board members you're going to have. It can be, just depends on, it can be 10, it can be 15, it can be 20. It can be as many as you want. They're differing, trains of thought on board members. It's, board members are a good source of knowledge and capital a lot of times. But if your board gets too big, it becomes kind of unwieldy, and you get a lot of differing views on things. And so my suggestion is that, your initial board be comprised of, usually it's going to be a group of people who have already been working on this particular issue. And, you establish your initial board with that core group of people, and then start bringing in people that you think can add value, whether it be through their time or treasure. So you want to give yourself enough leeway when you set the number of board members that, let's say you've got a core group of 5, you might want to set your board member number at 10. And bylaws can always be amended upon a majority vote of the organization. So you don't have to worry too much about getting everything right up front in your initial bylaws. One of the important provisions of the bylaws is a dissolution provision, which states what will happen in the event that the nonprofit is dissolved. And the IRS requires language stating that any assets will be distributed to another 501c3 organization. So if you shut down your 501c3 and you distribute the assets or any cash on hand to officers or board members, that creates a tax liability for those individuals, and also would be contrary to the nonprofit status of the company. So it's important to include dissolution language in your bylaws. You also need to apply for a federal identification number. That is the number that you'll use to file for your, file your taxes, file your request for tax exempt status with the IRS. There's a form to do that. It's called an SS4. So all of this can be done online. This is done through the IRS website. I think it's irs.gov. So you fill out your form SS4 to get your tax identification number. And then once you have your tax identification number, this is kind of where this is the most important thing a nonprofit can do, which is file with the Internal Revenue Service for nonprofit status. So what you do is you fill out a Form 1023-EZ, which most of the groups that we deal with would be would qualify to file a Form 1023-EZ. A Form 1023 is a much longer document, but if you've got gross income under $50,000 for the past 3 years, or you estimate that it's going to be under 50,000 for the next 3 years, and fair market assets under a certain amount, then you can file the 1023 EZ. And this is a screenshot of the 1023 EZ form. So you submit that to the IRS, and then you wait. You can't solicit any gifts or contributions until you're approved by the IRS, and it can take several months. The government doesn't work very fast, so you just have to be patient and wait for your 1023 authorization. It's $275 to file a Form 1023 EZ. So once you're approved by the IRS, you can begin soliciting tax-free donations. And then that leads to the ongoing maintenance and compliance part of your organization. So you also have to register once you get your IRS authorization. You have to register with the state of Georgia as a charity. So that's done by filing a Form C-100, which is right here, so that the state of Georgia knows, okay, you've incorporated as a nonprofit. You've now gone through the process to get your tax exempt status. You're now operating as a Georgia nonprofit with tax exempt status. So ongoing compliance. You have to file an annual registration with the state of Georgia to maintain your compliance. You'll get an annual, typically it'll come by email. It will say, annual registration renewal deadline, and it'll tell you what deadline you have to register by. I've had nonprofits, I've seen this happen, unfortunately, where someone misses the email. They don't go in and register. You'll get another email telling you that you're late. If you miss that one or you don't comply with the deadline, the state of Georgia will administratively dissolve your organization. I've seen it happen. So, that email, whoever's monitoring, the emails coming from the Secretary of State, needs to be someone that, is very trustworthy and diligent, and is going to make sure that the annual registration is completed, so that you stay in compliance with the state of Georgia. You also have to file a tax return, an IRS Form 990. Most organizations that would be interested in incorporating that are on this call can file a 990 EZ. That's for organizations with less than $100,000 in gross receipts. So, typically you'll want to engage an accountant to help you file your 990 EZ, which is right here. Looks like your standard tax forms. You also have to annually renew your charitable status with the state of Georgia for $20. That's a renewal notice. You'll get a renewal notice. Like I said, the Secretary of State will send you lots of emails and correspondence telling you when these deadlines come up. And you just have to be cognizant of looking out for those. So that is pretty much an overview of how you go about legally forming your nonprofit in a way that you can accept. People can make tax-free donations to you. So the benefit to the organization is you get money, and the individual making the donation can write it off on their taxes. As a deduction. What you'll do is when you get your IRS determination letter, what most nonprofits do is they just, whenever you get a gift, you send a letter to the person saying, we've received your gift. Thank you very much. And, no goods or services were exchanged in receipt of this gift. And so therefore it's tax deductible to the full extent of the law. But you'll have a letter of determination from the IRS that you can provide to anyone who needs it, if their accountant needs it. So, but that is an overview of how you legally set up a nonprofit. Are there any questions?
I had a question about membership.
Yes.
Can that be changed at any time?
So
When I started, I had that I would have no members, and now I'm thinking about having members. Can I change that status?
yes, you
Okay.
can amend your bylaws to state that you will have members. Yeah, and
Okay. Thank you.
members, can be, we have the board of directors, right? And then you have officers. That's who runs the company. But then, of course, you may want to have members who are just, they pay a fee to be a member, and they're not involved in the day-to-day management of the nonprofit, but they pay $50 a year, $25 a year just to belong to the organization. So yes, but that would require you to amend your bylaws in all likelihood.
So that would be the only place I would have to make the change. I don't have to let the state know any. It would just be in my bylaws, the change.
Yes, I believe so.
Now, I've actually got a follow-up question to that, right? If you were to be a membership organization, folks that have paid dues, do they then get a vote in any formal action of the organization?
Typically not with the nonprofit, no.
Okay.
Not like a stockholder where they're voting shares. They're just paying dues because they
Formal
believe in the
supporters.
mission.
Yeah. I've actually also got a question sort of following up with your discussion of when you established Buckhead Heritage. You said there was a group of folks sort of already interested in that support, but when you were putting together your officers and board, what was your experience in getting people to sign on to that commitment? Was it a challenge? And if it was a challenge, what were your strategies to engage folks to participate at that level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we had not to get too much into the weeds, but we had a group of people that had been working to establish a historic district in Buckhead. So these were neighbors, that all lived in one particular neighborhood. And so we had been working on an effort to have our neighborhood designated as historic by the city of Atlanta. This was not done under the umbrella of any sort of nonprofit. It was just people in the neighborhood that felt strongly about historic preservation and wanted to preserve the historic character of our neighborhood. That effort was unfortunately not successful, but out of that grew this belief and notion that there ought to be a historic preservation nonprofit in Buckhead. So I was fortunate in that there were a group of us that had already been working together on the historic district effort. And there were, some people that were more involved than others, and it was easy to find, two officers, out of that group. So I was the president, and, found, someone who was willing to serve as secretary, and then had someone with a financial background that was willing to serve as the treasurer. So once I lined up the three officers, there were other people who had been involved in the effort who, we just naturally went to and asked if they wanted to serve on the board. And they did. And then, so those were that was kind of the low hanging fruit. But then we did go more widely to the community to try and engage community members that we thought, we wanted to broaden our focus as much as we could. So we went and approached, community leaders that could be, we thought, helpful getting our message out. Something like that might not be necessary if, you're simply establishing a friends group for, rehabilitating a church or a building or something of that nature. But if you're doing something, and it still may make sense to have someone from the community involved. But the farther out you get from the core group, the harder it becomes to convince people to serve on your board, because there is a time commitment, and typically there'll be a financial commitment to serve on a board. I can't remember what the financial commitment was that we asked of our board members initially. I think it was like $250 per board member. But like Ben said, nonprofit is a tax status. It's not a management strategy. So you always need to be thinking about ways to create revenue. So what we did is, after we incorporated and we had our officers and board of directors, we had a kickoff fundraising party, and we found someone that was willing to offer up their house. And, we just sent out invitations and said, hey, we're forming a nonprofit historic preservation group in Buckhead. We're going to have a party, and we had food and drinks, and we charged a fee to attend. And did we charge a fee to attend the party? I can't remember. I think we may have just invited people to come and fed them and gave them some drinks, and then said, we'd love for you to contribute. But that's how we got our startup capital, was from that kickoff party. And then we formed a membership, which gave us a kind of recurring stream of annual income. We applied for grants here and there to help us rehabilitate a few cemeteries in Buckhead. So, but you always, to Ben's point, have to be thinking about, what is how are we going to generate a stream of revenue, right? And that revenue is going to ultimately go back into your mission. Some portion of it will go to, administrative things like, filing fees or hiring an accountant to prepare your tax return. Some portion of it will go into, paying, expenses associated with holding events. But at the end of the day, you want to be directing, I'm not sure what the rule of thumb is, Ben knows, but is 80% or what 70, 80% needs to go back to your mission? I mean, there's an accepted kind of,
I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule, but certainly in terms of, when folks look at 990s and things like that, being able to show that at least a majority of the funds you're raising are going directly into your mission, is a pretty important step. And the higher you can get that, the lower you can get your sort of administrative costs, and the higher you can get your mission-based expenses, the better off you're going to look from the perspective of donors.
Right. And, you don't need to hire anyone initially. Like, this can be done, aside from the filing fees, which can be, let's call it, all in $500 probably, to file all of your required forms, start to finish. You have to come up with that initial capital somehow, but you can be staffed entirely with volunteers. You probably are going to have to hire an accountant for the 990 easy, unless you've got someone with, accounting or tax background. But it can be done, relatively inexpensively, and by a purely volunteer force.
And in fact, that's what I would say the majority of sort of site-specific preservation nonprofits are almost exclusively volunteer led and managed. Are there any other questions sort of about the nuts and bolts of nonprofit?
I had another question about bylaws. I mean,
Sure.
not the bylaws, the board members. I come from a small little town. Um, a lot of us are related. Um, is there a problem with that? My whole board being related? I don't know how to get around it.
No, no, there's no problem with that. I mean, you do want to, and this is kind of getting, you know, down the road a bit, but, you know, and for small organizations, I mean, I say that, I mean, every organization ought to have a conflict of interest policy, right?
Yes.
That's really, it's not necessarily whether people are related, but what you do not want is people benefit who sit on the board benefiting financially from you know, the funds that are coming into the organization. So if you had, for example, you know, let's say you're rehabilitating a cemetery, right? And you happen to know someone who owns a monument company, right? And they sit on your board, okay? If you are raising money and then turning around and paying them to build the, you know, to make the monuments or do the repairs, you know, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, provided that, you know, there's a process in place to make sure that that you're paying fair market value. You know, you want to go and get some different, you know, bids, right? But a person who serves on, first of all, they should disclose that conflict of interest, right? If they're going to be receiving any money from the organization, and the board should approve the conflict, and you know, they approve it after making sure that, you know, that bid is the most competitive, or that there's some other compelling reason to go with that board member versus, you know, XYZ monument company down the street. But so no problem with related people serving on a board, but potential.
That be or
I think he's frozen.
no?
Did that answer your question?
Well, I had another. It kind of hit on something else. I had. Can I give an example that I want to know about?
Problem with board members profiting from.
What just happened?
He's frozen again.
Okay.
We work in a 120-year-old stone building, so the Wi-Fi is
Okay.
generally unreliable. Go ahead, and I'll see if
The
I
other
can.
question was, like I said, most of us are related on the board. We've been given a building by my community, for my organization. I think it's $1 a year. One way to make money is we've decided we will rent out some of the rooms. The reason we started a nonprofit, because as African Americans here in this community, we're not given buildings to start companies. So half of us needed that ourselves. So is there a problem with me renting the buildings to parts of the board?
To folks on the board.
Yes.
It shouldn't be, particularly because, particularly if you are renting them at fair market, or if you want to be really safe, maybe a little bit extra, as opposed to giving them a discount, or letting them have the space for free. Oh boy, I just got a text. Sorry, I just got a text message that Rhodes Hall internet has gone out. So we'll carry on. There should not be an issue with folks on your board renting space in your building. It goes back to the same sort of question, just making sure that they're not deriving any personal financial benefit and also controlling the decisions of the board. Does that make sense?
Okay. They can rent the room, but they can't make money by renting the room.
Well, no, so that your organization can make money by renting the room, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
But they can't
Okay.
derive a board member can't derive any personal financial benefit. So,
Okay. Yeah,
if
they can't rent one of my rooms and use it as a place to sell their books.
well, they could, but you can't give them a special deal because they're a board member.
Oh no. Okay, got it.
Right. And I can give you an example of that. In sort of a convoluted example, but there's an organization, a lot of nonprofit organizations like the Georgia Trust actually have a properties program where we'll buy and sell historic property. There was an instance in Savannah where the nonprofit organization had a historic property that they were going to sell. Someone on the board was interested in purchasing the property. And so in order to make sure that they were above board with everything, they they accepted, a number of bids. They offered the opportunity for anybody to buy it. The board members' offer was the only bid that came in, and they actually chose to make the board members purchase it for a higher price than what they had initially listed it for, just so that they could, clearly prove the point that there was no financial benefit to the person sitting on that board. And then, of course, they had to be recused from any of the decision-making process as well. So,
Okay.
if you have a building and you are looking to create revenue by renting out space, that is, number one, a great idea. Number two, there shouldn't be any reason that a board member couldn't be renting out that space, but you just need to make sure that they're not getting any sweetheart deal or any benefit that they wouldn't be getting outside of that board membership.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. We're gonna try to keep ourselves on track here. So we are more than happy to keep answering questions. Feel free to shoot an email to anybody that's on the call today. Anybody that registered for this will get a recording of the workshop, as well as the resources that we're referencing. So look for that follow-up email. But in the time we have remaining, we wanted to offer up the platform to provide a case study for exactly what we've been talking about. A group of dedicated individuals who recognized a preservation need, established a nonprofit, and have been wildly successful. I won't say overnight, because I think it's been about a 10-year process, but we wanted to give the opportunity for the Friends of Cherry Grove Schoolhouse to share their story, share their insights, and provide a real world example of how all of these steps can be put into play to save important resources around the state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barrett Hansen, who is, I believe, the founder of the organization, to share their story. And any of the other friends that are on the call that may be participating as well, we're really grateful for you all to be here today.
Thank you, Ben and Wright, for extending to us the invitation to share our experience. And yes, we do have several members of our board, Edward and Catherine Anderson and Linda Chestnut. If Linda, you would wave your hand there. Okay. I am going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that pretty clearly there? My font's a bit large there, so it shouldn't.
Yes.
Should be pretty. Okay, wonderful, good. So what most of what Ben and Wright have already gone over, we experienced firsthand, much of which we were informed about, much of which we learned on the job as we went along. As was mentioned, when one gets started early in a project like this, you get caught up in the romanticism of saving a great project until you are faced with the realities that it is really about fundraising. And we're going to talk about that. So what you see here is a 1910 Cherry Grove Schoolhouse located on the campuses of the Cherry Grove Baptist Church in Washington, Georgia, Wilkes County, Georgia. The schoolhouse, as I mentioned, was built around 1910, and we decided to see if this building could be possibly saved. What you see here is before we received a recognition on the National Register. It is before we started revitalization, obviously. It is before we received the award from the Marguerite Williams Foundation, well, Marguerite Williams Award for Excellence in Historic Preservation. Since it is on the campuses of the Cherry Grove Baptist Church, we thought it would be fitting and appropriate that we would entitle this journey by raising the question from the Old Testament, can these dry bones live? And so just by looking at this building, you can see that dry bones is much more, the problem that she had is much more than dry bones. I mean, just a few of them, there was a leaking roof. Foundation was sagging. The western wall, which is the left wall on the side without the windows, was completely non-salvageable. That whole wall had to be replaced. The floorboards were either rotten or missing. There was a problem with insect infestation, among other things. And so for us during this point to think that this building was worthy of being on the National Register, you can, without doubt, it was an ambitious project, to say the least. But this is what we started with. This is what we started with, all right? So our first question, property trumps project. Who currently owns the property? What is the owner's position regarding saving the property? And is the owner willing to grant stewardship for the benefit of the property? As was mentioned, the schoolhouse is on the grounds of the Cherry Grove Baptist Church. So they're the ones who own the deed. So we went to them with a proposition. And I want to piggyback on something that was mentioned, I think, by Ben when he asked if there was any competing entity in doing what you plan on doing. Just a little background on this. I grew up going to this particular church as long as I can remember. Every August, they would have friends. They would have friends and family day, what they call their annual reunion. And visitors and friends would come every year in August, and I would ride from Atlanta to Wilkes County to their annual meeting in August. And after the program, people will invariably go outside and visit the old schoolhouse. Well, every year you would always hear the question, I would hear this ever since I was a child, why don't they do something about the building? Why don't they do something about the building? Of course, no one would ever identify who the they were or exactly what they would do, although it was implied it needs to be repaired, all right, without getting into the specifics of who would do that. So this is something that I had heard from a child, and of course you would hear conversations about someone was going to revitalize or revamp the school building, but that would never happen. So there was a desire to do that. Since the church owned it, we went to the church leadership. We told them our plan. We would like to see if we could revitalize, rehabilitate the schoolhouse, the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse. The church leadership took it to their members. They had what they called in the rural South, a conference, which is basically a meeting. They had a conference, brought it to the board, brought it to the church membership, and the church membership agreed. They voted on it to whether or not to agree or to disagree. Thank goodness they decided to agree. Now, there were two deal breakers. Number one was issued by us, and the second one was issued by the church. Our provision was, we wanted to make sure that this project did not cause any undue financial strain on the church. It is a modest rural church. They don't even meet every Sunday. In fact, the primary reason that the building was in such a dilapidated state was simply economics. There was not funding to do anything else with the church. And so we wanted to make sure it was not any financial burden on the church. Their provision was they wanted to make sure the schoolhouse would not, excuse me, I said the church, I meant schoolhouse. They wanted to make sure the schoolhouse would not be moved. It was in the original location in which it was built back in circa 1910 on the grounds of the Cherry Groves Baptist Church. They wanted to make sure that the schoolhouse stayed there. And the reason that was an issue is because in the past, by an entirely different entity, it was suggested that perhaps the schoolhouse be moved to another location. For them, that was a deal breaker. Barring that, they agreed and they gave us stewardship over the whole revitalization project, which in effect gave us authorization to act on behalf of the church in everything related to the revitalization of the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse. They granted us stewardship so we could act on their behalf. But regarding the issue of property trumps project, had they not given us the authorization, then basically, from our experience, the idea would have been dead at conception. So we were blessed to get their blessing. So bottom line is whoever owns the deed is the king, and the king in this regard gave us their blessing. A gathering of like-minded individuals. This was something that was touched upon also, especially by Wright. Is there a team of core supporters? Number two, are the supporters vested in the project? And why is that important to be vested? And number three, is the team prepared to devote the necessary time and attention? We had a team of core supporters. When we initially approached Cherry Grove Baptist Church about the schoolhouse, it was myself, Reverend Ed Anderson, and his wife, Catherine Anderson, and my wife. So our core supporters was a core of four who originally made the proposition. Other supporters vested. Myself, I think Tracy mentioned the issue of everyone being related. Many of our board members, Ms. Tracy, are related, all right? Myself and Ed Anderson, we have a generational connection with the schoolhouse and the church, which goes back several generations. All right. And then, of course, there are our wives that come in under default, also related. And so the reason that being vested is so important is because this whole project is a long-term project. We found out that it as loving and as fulfilling it is oftentimes a project of attrition. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And it oftentimes, those who have some additional skin in the game, who are vested either by blood or by bond, and of course, there's no greater testimony of being vested than having some blood connection, which many of us do. And so because of the time and the attention and the energy that these projects tend to have, we have been on this. It took us 7 years just to go and get on the National Register. We started this back in 2015. Yes, it has paid off. However, if someone had told me early on that it would take this long, pardon me, I don't know if I would have agreed. However, it is always good to have someone who has some additional skin in the game. My grandmother attended this building, or I went to this theater when I was a kid, or or something of that nature to have some type of emotional connection. It's not mandatory, but it's good to have. One of our board members, in fact, our treasurer, was a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, long removed from Wilkes County, Georgia, geographically. Grew up, raised, educated in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but her particular connection was her mother, who grew up in Virginia, attended a one-room schoolhouse, just like the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse. So she could identify through her mother. So again, it's the idea of being vested is always beneficial. Is the team, and here again, I've answered that, is the team prepared to devote the necessary time and attention? It does take a lot of time. Here again, especially when we were vying to get on the national register, documentation after documentation after documentation. It is time consuming. So if one is motivated, that's good. But even one's motivation, one's connection, one's body of knowledge, all of that's good, but it will take a team of people to do this. And the whole journey is evidence that this historic preservation is indeed a team sport, because I was motivated, I was enthusiastic, I had a relatively good degree of knowledge of the subject, the schoolhouse. However, there's no way that any one person could have possibly done this on their own. A group of core supporters is mandatory. It just can't be done without it, from our experience. Know your end user. In other words, what is the property saved for? For what purpose? What will it take to save it? And how will the property be sustained? How will the property be sustained? What is the property being saved for? Well, oftentimes there are, I guess, those who are in love with a particular property to get out and say, well, this building, just like those who, in the case of the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse, say it needs to be saved. It needs to be saved. It needs to be revitalized, and efforts need to be taken so that nature doesn't just pull the building down. But ultimately, the question is, what are you saving it for? In other words, for what particular purpose? That is something which the question was asked to us early on, because we didn't just want the schoolhouse to be saved and revitalized into the 1910 condition that it was. Okay, if someone were to snap their fingers and it is in the condition, the ideal condition that you would want, then what? Then what? Because you're still going to have expenses. So we decided early on that since the schoolhouse originally was built to teach, why not continue with that legacy? However, now the schoolhouse will be able to teach the evolution of African-American education in Wilkes County, Georgia, to teach the fact that these one-room schoolhouses, such as the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse, these one-room schoolhouses did more to eradicate mass illiteracy among African-Americans in the rural South than any other institution. To make the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse a focal point of road trips for high school and elementary school students, to show them how education, especially in the rural South, has evolved, and to make it a point of interest for those who are interested in regional, state, and regional history. Because as for right now, the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse is the only singular African-American institution in Wilkes County, Georgia, that's on the National Register. So early on, we were pressed to come up with a purpose. What do you want to do to revamp the schoolhouse? You're not just going to restore it, but once it is restored, once it is rehabilitated, then what's the plan? What is the plan? And early on, again, in addition to that, through one of our connections, we were advised of, or given a connection with a contact at the University of Georgia, in terms of, I'm addressing here in terms of what it takes to save it. Early on, we had what was called a historic structure report, historic historic structure report. And we were blessed to have graduate students from the University of Georgia come and conduct that. Now, historic structure report, HSR, basically is a full physical of the building. It will tell you what is missing, what is needed, what needs to be done, and what needs to be done architecturally in terms of suggestions. That was a big plus because the historic structure report breaks down, okay, this is of primary importance. This is secondary. This can be done third. What needs to be done in the order? From that historic structure report, you can go with your contractor or your architect and find out exactly what it will take to save the building. That was vital also, to know what we are looking for in terms of how much time, how much interest, possibly how much money it will take to save this building. How will the property be sustained? This is a question which eventually would distinguish us from some of our competitors. And I say competitors because it was mentioned earlier that all of us are competing for some of the same dollars, all of us. And so being able to answer how the building will be sustained was of particular value to us. In other words, here again, what would you use the building for and how can it sustain itself? Again, we had ideas of making it a building that can be used for perhaps even weddings and centers for field trips for high schools and for elementary schools. We had a plan for the building use after we were able to successfully get it entirely refurbished. How will it be sustained? Next, building the case for historical significance. Here again, this gets back into the issue of documentation. Can the team provide sufficient documentation to prove historical significance? Is there a primary point of contact responsible for all communications with the National Register? And is there a team member responsible for gathering, collecting, and submitting to the person of contact? When we were vying for a listing on the National Register, we basically had to prove, and others who have done this, they understand what I'm referring to here, you have to prove your worthiness. As widely known as a particular structure may be, or the historical or cultural or religious or educational value it may have, it has to be proven. And with our submission of documentation, I was the one primarily responsible for gathering information. And they would ask for pictures and newspaper articles and narrations and interviews and whatever type of documentation that could be gathered to prove the worthiness. We were able to get several attendance records from the schoolhouse, as well as teachers' weekly pay, which was quite interesting. We were able to get records from the early 1920s, which provided interesting information. It had the teacher's acceptance of her pay for that particular month, as well as the attendance of the students. And on several of those attendants, I was able to find my grandmother, who attended the school up until the 5th grade, things of that sort, which had to be submitted. But since the body of information was so large, I turned that over to a team member, who in this case was Ms. Catherine Anderson, and she was responsible for sending the information on to the main contacts at the National Register and responding to whatever inquiries or questions they may have had. But here again, this is just an example of how it takes a team to do this, because some of this documentation and the timelines that they have can really be overwhelming. Making the cut. So the process Who will make the final presentation? Sale to close the case. And what is the state registrar's board recommendation? Well, the process is we had to present a PowerPoint presentation down at the Sloppy Fuller building in Atlanta, down the street from the Capitol, and make our case, to sell our case on the worthiness of the Cherry Grove Baptist Church. And we, as well as may have been about six other applicants who were doing the same thing. And so you present your case, and if they have any questions, they will pose those questions. And then the board will make a decision as to whether or not they give you the nod. Yes, you have made the state cut, and your building or your property, your project has been recommended for the state registration, state list of historic places, and we are going to recommend it for the national. Well, we were fortunate enough to make the cut, and we were recommended for the National Register. It took quite some time. However, during the time of our registration was right when COVID hit. So that really slowed things down. But February, I think it took about 7 months before we got the nod. In February, we finally got the notice that we were on the National Register. Preparation for the second phase. So everything that I have been mentioning is the first phase. We see this whole project, our experience has been this whole project can be capsulized into two phases. The first phase is documentation. After documentation, the second phase is the fund phase, and this fund spelled F-U-N-D. And from here on out, it's about that second phase. So here again, which we have heard since the last hour, some of the items: selecting your executive officers and executive committee. Your core supporters, at least in our situation, the core supporters eventually transferred to our executive officers. As I mentioned, the Andersons, Reverend Ed Anderson became our vice chair. Catherine Anderson became our secretary. Linda Chestnut is a board member, as well as her husband, David Chestnut, who is a practicing attorney, gave us very valuable legal advice. And so we eventually brought our officers together from our core supporters. We wrote our bylaws, as had been mentioned. I was able to find actually a set of bylaws online on the net and tweak them to include and to reflect our mission statement. We established our 501c3, of course, which one has to submit with the bylaws, which determine how your corporation will be ruled with the bylaws. It made sense. And we built our board and organization. We brought in as our treasurer, Jackie Tucker, who is a financial professional. She served as our treasurer. We brought in James Simpson, who is also a member of the Cherry Grove Baptist Church, because we wanted the church to have some representation on our board. Also, we brought in Miss Kay Fennell, who was a retired school teacher in Washington Wilkes here, and she was our subject matter expert in everything related to education and schools in Wilkes County, Georgia. And we had an honorary board member, Miss Nancy Cohen Gumby, the late Miss Nancy Cohen Gumby, who grew up in the school, who was a former teacher there and grew up in the Cherry Grove Baptist Church. So we had a relative small board. There is definitely a benefit to that, which was a good thing, but we had a committed board. And so I really understood what Wright was talking about when he said to try to keep your board relatively small, especially when it comes time to making decisions. Learning how to fish, fish being a term which I learned a few years ago, which referenced donations, collecting money, baiting. All right, write and know your compelling story, duplicate that story on social media, document and broadcast major milestones, welcome strategic alliance. each one of us, each one of the board members had their own their own way of delivering their compelling story. Each one of them can deliver with passion, persuasion, and clarity, based on their experiences. So key to promoting our project was being able to duplicate or to tell or to sell our story. And as mentioned, we would tell that story on social media, on our website, on our Facebook site, and we would document and broadcast major milestones. Okay, we have made it to the state register. We broadcast that. We would advertise that. Now we've made it to the national register. Now we have started construction. This is the current status of construction. Here now we are about to have our grand opening and our dedication. And most recently, we were awarded the Marguerite Williams Award for Excellence in Historic Preservation. All of these milestones are documented and broadcast. And then, of course, the last point here, welcome strategic alliances. There is an organization, the Watkinsville Junior American Citizens, which visited the schoolhouse several years ago. And they were so delighted to hear our story. Here again, we go back to the story. So delighted to hear our story, not only our story, the story of the schoolhouse, but also the story of the revitalization of the schoolhouse, until they basically adopted us as their own. And so that particular alliance has been extremely, extremely beneficial. Learning how to fish part 2, draft case statement, letter writing campaign, informational trifolder, speaking engagements. Draft case statement, basically a statement which shows your worthiness, your mission, and your value, the value of your organization, the value of this particular project. And it can be tweaked to focus on donations or however one chooses to do so. Letter writing campaign, obviously a trifold, informational trifold, which can be, we have them distributed to at our Chamber of Commerce down here, in libraries, wherever they will allow you to put information of this sort. Speaking engagements, we do this also. Here again, every type of platform that we can tell our story, allow us to tell our story, we do so. We have spoken at the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of American Revolution, the Washington Wilkes County Chamber of Commerce, the historical societies, various churches, especially during Black History Month, to tell them about our story and the evolution of African-American education, which is represented by the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse, one of only about a dozen remaining in the whole state. And last but not least, this is just some guerrilla marketing here. Items, tools in your tackle box. Most of these are simply platforms at little or no charge, platforms that allow you to tell your story and to make it easy to gather donations. One thing that we learned, no historic preservation without sponsored donations. We've learned that the donations are basically the engine, the oil that grease the engine to this whole project. So we have PayPal account, GoFundMe, Facebook Giving Month and Giving Tuesday, Cash App, Zelle, here again, making it easy, corporate matching and funding, mailing lists of Georgia Trust and Historic Preservation, historic places, just to stay in the know. Obviously, your circle of family and friends, because these are some of the first people that we go to when it comes to funding. Maintenance fund and perpetual trust fund. We have 2 accounts, one just for ongoing maintenance for expenses, operating expenses, and a perpetual trust fund, which we try not to touch, and we keep it for perpetual use. Network of organizational memberships and affiliation. So initially we ask, can these dry bones live from this old dilapidated building you see here? And so we say, yes, these dry bones can live. And that has been our experience.
Thank you so much, Barrett. I'll open the floor to any questions that folks may have for the Friends of Cherry Grove. but I will also go ahead and lead off with a question. So for
Mhm.
you, Barrett, or any of the other friends that are on the call, what would you say is the bit, now that you've crossed all of these major hurdles, looking forward and sort of how you're operating now, what do you see or foresee as your biggest challenge as a nonprofit organization moving forward?
I would say keeping the interest going, especially after anyone can come by and see, okay, the building is well restored. You have rehabilitated it. And you have, and now let me distinguish between rehabilitating and just refurbishing. We did not just want to restore the building to 1910 condition. We wanted rehabilitation is limited restoration with added amenities. So now on the west side of that wall, the back side, there is a small air condition. We've added air condition, we've added heat, we've added lights. And so it is obvious to see the building now, see, okay, you're up and running. And now, so the challenge is, it is a little bit harder now to make the argument for donations. It prompts us to be a bit more creative, because anyone can clearly see that the building is well established now. So, okay, now we are selling the next phase. That is the biggest challenge then. If you were to drive by and you would see a tarp over the building, or you see contractors outside, okay, they are working on the building. Now they have worked on the building. They have had the grand opening. Now what? And so that right now here again is the biggest challenge there. Ed, Catherine, Linda, would you like to add to that?
I think that's a really valuable point. It's in preservation, it is easy to define the need when you see the building in distress.
Exactly. Right.
Right. And one thing that you've already mentioned that I think was really, really smart on the Friends Group part was, in your initial fundraising, you were already planning for that maintenance fund, or
Yes.
raising money. I'm never going to say it's an easy time to raise money, but raising money when it was easier because the need was obvious, but utilizing some of those funds to be held for a rainy day and for long-term maintenance.
Exactly. In fact, we have to thank David, our resident attorney, David Chestnut, for that. He made us aware of that very early on, because again, initially our focus, we were up. Let me speak for myself. I was caught up in the romanticism of saving this grand, modest building that my grandmother attended. But early on, you're faced with the reality. Okay, beyond the romanticism of rebuilding or saving this building is fundraising. And even beyond the fundraising, once you get it to the ideal position, then what? And that gets to the question, what are you saving it for? How is it going to be sustained?
And oh, go ahead.
Do you have any programs in the building? Any terms of having that 3 times a year we do this lesson or celebration to tell the story? Or how are you incorporating any kind of programmatic thrust to keep the interest going and purpose for people to come visit?
Excellent question. With right now, the program ahead of us is in July. There is a family reunion, which happens to be our family reunion, whereby the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse will be a primary focus of in terms of events and visiting sites. That's one thing. Number 2, with the local Chamber of Commerce, another strategy of the marketing is to make the site known for visitors, because one of the realities that we had to come to grips with was that we are not in the historic preservation business, we are in the tourism business. And so we are selling it as a tourist site with those who come to Washington Wilkes. So we have a model of the schoolhouse in the local Chamber of Commerce, whereby we have our brochures and other informational items to direct people to the Cherry Grove Schoolhouse. But we do plan on having some type of annual event. In fact, we talked about it last year, annual event to keep especially the funding going, because it is an ongoing journey.
And we're also trying to extend the word for educational purposes as far as the school systems are concerned. We have been getting out the word to other county school systems and hoping that we will begin to set up a schedule whereby the children will be able to come on their field trips to see the school and learn about the education during the 1910 era.
Additionally, we have had an Educators Day in October of last year, and we hope to have perhaps an Educators Day every year, but we have to be careful about the time because that's football season. And as a result, we didn't have the numbers that we wanted, but we had the interest as told to us by the superintendents. We do want to be a part of the active Wilkes County tourism industry. That's one of our primary things here with the tour of homes. And we have been on the tour of homes on one occasion, and it is our intent to sign up for tour of homes every year, whereby people come from all over the state, even nation, to visit some of the old antebellum homes, the library, and other places in town. My wife and I, since we live here, we're able to help the chairperson and others by being available to conduct the tours during the tour of homes, and also to give private tours to people who call and say, when and where can I see the school? Our number's out there, and we want to make sure people can gain access at any time. And Linda Chestnut also makes herself available, and we were fortunate to have her. For she has a couple of degrees in revitalization and tourism and so forth. So we're able, the three of us are able to make ourselves available almost at moment's notice. We asked for a couple of days, but if one of you would like to come and see the schoolhouse, we'll be happy to accommodate you on a one-on-one basis if you like.
I would like to do that. I don't know where WAC is, even geographically where you're located in the state, but clearly I have interest.
Okay, this is Sylvia McGee.
I'll put my information in the chat.
Yes, if you would, and we'll do the same thing.
And we'll certainly, in our follow-up email, we'll include the Friends Cherry Grove's website, which provides contact information, tells in depth all of the history and all of the accomplishments like Barrett mentioned. That's one thing I think you all have done a very good job with, is being very, like you said, being very public about every step of the way and highlighting your accomplishments. Now, I do have
Ben,
one more.
Can I
go ahead,
just
please.
one more thing, Ben?
Yes.
We are grateful for the success we've enjoyed, and two more facets of it, two more reasons for it, is our liaison with the church as we've gone along, keeping them informed as to what's happening and why it's happening, and having them visit. And even one of the deacons has a key and is able to take the congregation in, and or family members who may have toured down through the year, who may have attended down through the years. The other reason is the leadership we've had. We're fortunate to have Barrett Hansen, who is in the middle of a professional career, knows how to lead, and his ego is just it's a mellow ego that causes people to gravitate towards him and his leadership. He keeps us all on the same sheet of music and moving forward. So we're grateful for that type of leadership that enables us to move forward. It's very important to have the right kind of.
Now let me ask a question less about the building and the project and more about how you all think about your organization and structure. Obviously, you've got your committed core group of folks. You have, as you mentioned, put in even more effort than you anticipated at the beginning of the process. You've got a plan for use and maintenance of the site. What are you all thinking about in terms of, for lack of a better term, maintenance of the organization and sort of your strategies for how the organization maintains itself beyond your initial core group? And are you thinking about that?
Yes, we are definitely thinking about that. With the exception of myself and my wife, all of our members are retired. And so we are about the only two who are still working. So we like to say what we do for posterity, and included in that is looking at the next generation of leaders. And so Ed and I, oftentimes we have meetings with various family members, or we may see someone within the community, and we nod at each other and say that would be a good person to bring on. Because the continuity of the organization, of the corporation, is what it is, of the corporation, has to be considered. And to be realistic, we have to look at our particular age, our particular tenure, and how this can be succeeded, or how baton can be passed. So yes, that is a real question, which forces us to make decisions and considerations that you may not automatically think of. But if you are really doing this for posterity, there has to be a continuation. Who's going to step in next? It has to be. It's not an easy one. It's not an easy one, because one of the reasons, and Ed and I were talking about this morning, if I was pressed as to what would be the single solitary reason for our phenomenal success, if our head was forced to put it in one word, it would be the board. It would be the board, without doubt. Without doubt. I have no doubt about that. But now, so how do you repeat that for the next generation? That's the question.
Absolutely. It's critical for nonprofits of any size to be thinking about that. And like you said, that's, it's not an easy question to answer. But given the amount of effort that is required, especially if you're starting from scratch like you all did, it is easy for folks to burn out. It is easy for founders to either we see frequently with founders, either one, they burn out fast as well, and they are the primary motivators for everybody else, or two, they become so ingrained in the organization as with themselves and the organization that they can't see beyond sort of their personal vision. Those are the two sort of issues for nonprofits that are starting from scratch. Having a healthy and active board is important to guard against that, but also to always be thinking about, like you said, how do we make this sustainable into posterity and beyond sort of this initial lift, is something to really be thinking about. Because tying back to our initial part of the conversation, if you're taking the steps to create a nonprofit, you are doing a ton of work. You don't want to do that work just for a short amount of time. You need to be thinking about how that organization and incorporation is going to be sustainable over time. And part of that is not just fundraising, but also, who is the organization. So I really, really am grateful for you all providing your example today. As you mentioned, you've had tremendous success at every stage of the process. You all have done what needed to be done to find that success. So we're grateful that you all participated today and shared your story and your experience. And we're grateful for those folks who've joined the call. Hope you've gotten something out of it. We do have a little bit more time. If there are some more questions, we're happy to hang out. But otherwise, thank you all so much.
I do have one other thing to add, Ben. The restoration is not, obviously not just the outside. I should have added a picture to the interior. There are items, furnishings from the 1910s to the 1920s inside the schoolhouse. We have desks in there, student desks. We have benches. In fact, one original bench that's in there. We have the bell. We have what's called our wall of fame, in which we have, for instance, George Washington Carver, because the great scientist, a lot of people don't know that George Washington Carver, one of the greatest scientists of his day, actually came to Wilkes County. There is a picture of R.R. Moten on the field. R.R. Moten, who succeeded Booker T. Washington, also came to Wilkes County. Less than 20 feet away from, R.R. Moten was the man after whom they named Moten Field, where the Tuskegee Airmen's trained. And less than 20 feet away from the door of the schoolhouse is the burial ground of a Montford Point Marine. And so all of this is incorporated in our story. What you don't see out here is a interpretive story box, as well as 2 panels, which we subsequently added to this picture here. There is a 106-year-old matriarch buried in the cemetery that's out there, born in 1843, died in 1949. When she died, we were in the atomic age. She's a part of the story. And so it's not just the schoolhouse. Part of the story is the schoolhouse, the church, the cemetery, and world history. That particular woman who lived to be 106 years old, she lost 4 children, 4 daughters during the 1919 Spanish flu. How is it that during World War I, an anarchist assassinated a king in Croatia? How did that affect the people in Wilkes County? Well, when the soldiers came back to America, they brought the Spanish flu with them, and she suffered because of that. So it's all connected. It's all connected.
Powerful. Powerful.
I have a question.
Yes.
First is I love y'all's story.
Oh,
But what if the building has already been restored? The building that I'm trying to get, well, I've been granted the building, but it has been restored for a kindergarten. It was a building, the only African American building for the students there in our location, but it's been restored to kindergarten, and then they moved out, and then they were just going to use it for storage. And I asked for it because of its significance to our community. It is still in the Black community, a part of the Black community, but it's no longer has its appearance as it did when in the 50s. Will it still be considered historical? I mean, it is, but the building has been changed. Does that make it not?
Well, I'll try to answer that briefly. And unfortunately, the easiest answer is it depends.
Okay.
It depends on a couple of things. Number one, the most basic is sort of what is the period of significance for that building. So if there is a sort of defined era that gives that building its specific historic significance, Cherry Grove is an easy example because its period of significance is the time that it was from when it was built to when it quit serving as a educational institution. Right. So that's the sort of the first thing to determine is sort of what period gives it its historic significance. And then if there have been alterations outside of that sort of era, it then depends on whether or not those alterations would be reversible, so you could get it back to its appearance from its historic era.
No.
So are you based in Georgia?
Yes.
Okay.
Chattooga County.
Okay. So in Georgia, the Historic Preservation Division which Barrett referred to. They're the ones that administer the National Register program.
Okay.
That'd be the place to start, to just sort of talk about, this is the building I have. I'm interested in potentially getting it on the National Register. Here's what it looks like now, and here's, sort of the history of it. They will come back to you probably with one of two answers. One, it's may have lost its integrity and is not eligible, but more likely they'll come back and say, we need more information, which is what Barrett was talking about in terms of documentation and documentation.
Okay.
That is the process for sort of historic recognition through the National Register. I will say, from a preservation perspective, fundraising and historical research and National Register listing typically go hand in hand, but they don't necessarily. Depending on what your nonprofit does and is trying to accomplish, you can be utilizing a historic or old building and still meeting your mission if your fundraising isn't necessarily directly tied to the preservation of the building. Not knowing sort of what your nonprofit is, you may be able to function within that historic building without tying directly to, its historic significance. From a preservation perspective, I think absolutely, to Barrett's point, tying that history and telling that story to the fundraising of, maintaining this building is certainly the best way to go.
Okay. And one more question, I'll leave y'all alone. But is this only pertains to building, because the whole community is historical. The one street in the whole town is the whole street for the Black community, for a reason. It's a mill town, and that was the way it was constructed. The same people that lived there in the early 1800s were their descendants. We still live in the houses. So does that just pertain to buildings, or can you get the whole street historical? You have that building, you have the church beside the building, which was the first educated place for the African American. Then you have the graveyard, which was built, which only which only has African Americans in the graveyard. All of that is, can I have the whole thing register? Is it just buildings? I don't know. My mind just clicks sometimes, and I just want to.
That's good thinking. That's good thinking.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, because from a preservation perspective, again, from a nonprofit preservation perspective, this is something that goes back to sort of our initial discussion about what are you trying to accomplish? What is your mission?
Our mission is to make just to preserve our history of African Americans and tell our history. Also give a platform for the marginalized community that doesn't have buildings, to can't do business because of just some other reasons. I just don't want to get into it really about exactly, but I'm trying to help take care of some issues that we're having there, and with racial issues. So I'm opening the building to provide for people who haven't been provided for. And so it's still along the same lines. And we're educating people within the Black community and outside of the Black community concerning the Black community. So it's an educational place to come, and tourist place, because it was a mill town.
Yeah, so that's sort of two parallel answers, I guess. It sounds like the mission of your organization would be tied sort of more broadly to the preservation of an entire area or district, because you're based on education. The challenge there, and this may be something that the Friends had to consider. The challenge there is capacity, right? The thing that makes a schoolhouse or a sort of an individual property as a focus of a nonprofit what makes that easier is that there's a real defined ask and defined need, right? When you broaden that to a broader district, it just makes the ask a lot bigger. But to your point, it absolutely and to Barrett's point too, there are broader stories to tell, right?
Yeah.
From a preservation perspective, not necessarily a nonprofit, but just pure preservation, you absolutely can get designation for a district as opposed to individual properties.
Okay.
And a mill village is one of probably the best examples of that, because individual buildings within a mill village may or may not have a level of significance that would make them worthy of getting listed in the National Register. But when considered as a whole, and considering the developmental history of that site, they almost certainly meet that level of significance. So, going back to my previous answer to you, I would, if you reach out to the Historic Preservation Division, I would approach it as the broader resource, as the mill village, for consideration in the National Register.
And
thank you.
Catherine has something she would like to share. The two of us attended a Washington Historical Foundation program about 2 weeks ago. Nathan Betchler, Betcher, from the National Park Service, United States Department of Interior, was there. And he talked about a program called Reconstruction Era National Historic Network. And specifically, he talked about whole towns or communities, et cetera, being placed in the National Historic Network. There's a lesser standard for admission into the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network than there is to be placed on the Register of Historic Places, either state or national. But Catherine is going to place in the I think she's already placed in the chat box the person's name, and she's going to put the website and phone number for Ms. Cheney to consider calling. He gave some valuable information, and he's really looking to pull as many communities and small areas in as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that resource.
Okay.
All right, we are just a bit over time. Are there any other questions about Friends of Cherry Grove's experience, or more broadly, nonprofits as they pertain to historic preservation? If not, again, thank you all so much for your time this morning. We really appreciate it. Please do look out for that follow-up email from the Georgia Trust that will include a recording of today's talks, as well as links to different resources that were referenced. So we really appreciate your attendance, your commitment to historic preservation in Georgia and elsewhere. And we hope you will continue your efforts, however, at whatever stage of the process you're in.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Hope
Thank
you
you,
all
Ben.
have,
Wonderful opportunity.
hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Opportunity. Thank you. Take care.
Best wishes to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We close out. Let's look at this.